Introduce our trick-or-treat speaker, Professor Michael Sand. I think probably most of you know Professor Sand about as well as you do me. He wears really two hats while he's with us this fall in Muncie. He's the acting director of the Muncie Children's Museum and has been one of the prime movers in getting that museum started and well on its way. He's also a visiting critic and professor in architecture and is teaching a fourth-year studio. Michael did his schoolwork first of all at Colorado, where he studied architecture, and then at Rhode Island School of Design, where he studied industrial design. He has taught there for the last 10 or 12 years. For the last 8, 9 years, he's had a practice in Cambridge and Harvard Square, Michael Sand and Associates. He has done a lot of exhibit work. He's going to show us some of that tonight. And without any further ado, I think I'd like to turn over this podium to Mr. Michael Sand. Not much of an intro.
Good evening. My main concern or nervousness tonight has not to do with the talk I'm about to give, but I very carefully went out and bought a whole big bag of Milky Ways, which I put in the freezer, seeing as it's one of my favorite treats to give away on a night like tonight. And I'm very fearful at this very moment my house is being trashed by a bunch of irate children because there's no one there to dispense them, or that I'm going to be stuck coming home and there'll be all these goodies that I'm going to be tempted to eat. That's my main apprehension tonight. Can you all hear me? Okay. The topic I've chosen to talk about tonight, the serious business of play, is a borrowed title. It's actually, I owe a debt to a woman by the name of Dr. Catherine Silver, who's a psychologist working in Oxford right now with Dr. Jerome Bruner. She is studying with Bruner a series of phenomena that have to do with how human beings apprehend information. In other words, how all of us learn what we know. And they have focused their work on how newborns and infants first start to perceive phenomena in this world and how they order that phenomena into some kind of coherent set of skills that they can then build on. My talk is not going to be as serious about play as that, but I thought the title was a good introduction to some of the things I wanted to show you, all of which are characterized by an attitude that has been adopted in the planning of them, and that is that people learn, and that means children as well as adults, best when they're not taught at. People teach themselves best. In most of the work that I've had a chance to undertake in the last 15 years, there has been an opportunity to try to be a troublemaker, a problem maker. The assumption being that if in the work that you produce you cause some kind of predicament to be resolved, either for your client, for yourself, for the user, that there's more likely to be an engagement, some real concern and caring. It has often been my attempt to try and do that with a lightheartedness or a humor, so that it doesn't become heavy-handed. And what I perhaps would like to do now is start the slides and show you some of the examples of things that I've had a chance to be involved in. I will comment that for the last 2 years, a principal piece of work for me has involved, as some of you know, the planning of the educational and cultural components of a new national park in Lowell. And I have, because of the scope of that project, decided not to talk about that at all tonight, And for those of you who are particularly interested in that, I apologize. But there is a coherence to this other body of work that I thought would be a more useful presentation. So if we can have the slides. We are on, okay. Lights? The first thing I'd like to suggest is that some of you may be familiar with this. This is in San Francisco, next to the cannery. Learning doesn't take place just in learning environments. And education, in my opinion, shouldn't be confined to educational institutions. People are frankly more likely to learn, I think, in places where they're not being taught. The spirit of a society that allows crazy things to happen in non-conventional ways has always delighted me and frankly makes me much more receptive, and I suspect a lot of other people are really pleased to come upon things like this. And that goes for serious issues as well as frivolous ones like this. This is, as you can probably discern, a panhandler who stays in that box all day, and when you put a coin in the slot, he'll come out and play any song you want. Some of my work is a lot more deliberate and has a purpose and a goal. One of the things that I have done over the years is develop a series of curriculum materials for use in classrooms. And these have primarily been developed as part of teams of people, where there have been educators, scholars, designers, collaboratively working. I, for about 8 or 9 years, been the design director for a group called Education Development Center. And as part of one of the courses we developed, we produced a series of probably 30 booklets and many pieces of film and other media, one of which was a book which proposed to teach 5th grade students, 11-year-olds, about some college-level issues that you probably first had addressed to you when you were a freshman here. The notion, in this case, being that everything does have a structure and a function, whether it's a man-made object or a natural object. I'm just going to go through some of the pages of the book because I think it's self-explanatory. Not only classroom materials, but many exhibits we've done have also tried to deal with fundamental issues which are probably better categorized as design education or visual awareness. One of the nice things about working for zoos or children's museums is that you have a very honest audience. If they don't understand something, they'll break it or they'll walk away. They'll make it very plain to you that you're not getting across. And so you're constantly challenged with the idea of coming up with ideas or methods of teaching that are intrinsically appealing, seductive, engaging, and that really try very hard to make something very, very graspable. One of the exhibits at the new birdhouse we developed proposed to talk about the shape of eggs and why they're shaped the way they are. And the notion was to have a series of cast brass or bronze eggs of different shapes and allow kids to roll them on a billiard table type surface and just recognize that round objects like a bowling ball will roll in any direction, that ovoid objects will roll in an arc, and that pointed objects like a pointed egg will roll in a circle. This is part of an exhibit which explains why cliff-dwelling birds lay pointed eggs, because the consequences of an egg rolling on a cliff would be disastrous for the egg, whereas birds that lay eggs in nests or in the sand, like an ostrich or something, there's really very little consequence to rolling, and so eggs tend to be of a more spherical nature. very simple idea, but just letting kids roll shapes becomes a simple way of getting that point across. We developed a whole series of exhibits at a new birdhouse in Boston, each of which tried to teach one simple idea very eloquently. Instead of trying to have exhibits which dealt with a complicated issue, we broke everything down into very, very simple distillations and then invited kids in each and every case to do something that related to the exhibit. And the doing something was not button pushing. The critical thing in this exhibit and all the exhibits we worked on is to develop an activity which is analogous to what you're trying to teach. Because it does no good to teach a kid to press a button to light up an answer unless you're trying to teach them how to light up buttons. That you need to develop an activity or a way of engaging their sensibilities and present a problem that relates to what you're trying to get them to recognize. So if it's a camouflage issue, you have to ask them to find something. In the case of that first exhibit on the right-hand screen, there's a balance beam, a balance, and two skeletons, one of which is a bird, one of which is a mammal. The bird is bigger, and you asked which one flies. Well, the assumption would be that the smaller one would fly, but of course the solid one has solid bones, and the bird has hollow bones, and so the issue of how heavy are bird bones was dealt with in a way that didn't force us to have kids picking up the things, because we couldn't. This was a very high-risk environment. But there is a way for a kid to test his own premise. There were a series of these issues, sort of lining the walls. An old gimmick, but the anatomy of a bird is identical to that of a human in terms of the bones that exist. It's just that the proportions are different. And as a way of making that clearer, we labeled a chicken skeleton photomural with the names, not the anatomical names that the ornithologists wanted us to use, but with the names of human parts. So chickens now have elbows and knees and heels and things that a kid can relate to. And those are written in reverse typography, backwards, so that as a child looks across at a mirror opposite that balcony, he can see not only his own parts labeled, but chickens, and start to see that they're the same number of toes and joints and so on. On the right is a much more elaborate teaching device. It's in fact a programmed learning device we developed, which is programmed so that if you start to make a line of reasoning, for example, if you answer the first question, if a male and a female in mating season look alike, then there's a certain concomitant thing that follows in terms of their courtship display. It would then either be the job of the male or both the male and the female. If your answer look different, then you have to answer male or the second button won't light up. If you answer it incorrectly, the first light goes out as well. So that you have to build a progression through the sequence and construct a very logical series of arguments, essentially. And it's a multiple choice test, really. And in fact, the device can be reprogrammed for different messages. And this was our attempt to try and make exhibits which were trying to be more challenging in terms of dealing with a very sophisticated piece of data. The idea of trying to do things that appeal to different age levels becomes a very critical issue, and things having to appeal to a wide range of things. Most of you, I'm sure, grew up as I did, thinking that birds flew like this. Well, in fact, they don't. They do something much more analogous to swimming. And the way of making that apparent without having to go through a long discussion was simply to create a runway and let kids be guided, their hands be guided by the railings of the runway. And as they simply walk down this thing and let their hands glide over the railing, the action became understandable without them having to think first. They first got the feeling and then perhaps recognized it. There were some philosophical issues we tried to get at as well, not just the technical ones, but the idea of that for all living things, the future equals surviving young relates to birds, it relates to butterflies, it relates to men. And the point of that exhibit was a neon changing neon sign, and I can go back. There were 3 or 4 different signs essentially incorporated into that one device, and a timing device kept clicking them. Click, 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 click. While the message stayed the same, the image changed. And it was a simple message. The idea of the birdhouse, of course, was to raise certain issues about survival that were generic to all living things. And we wanted people to make it known to people that we weren't just talking about birds, but things we talked about applied to humans and other species. To that end, we have developed a series of other devices at the Children's Zoo at Franklin Park, which involve creating pairs of apparatus for both children and animals. Duplicate apparatus, 2 of each were made for the mountain lions and the kids, the goats and the kids, the spider monkeys and the kids, and so on. Some of you in my 4th year studio will recognize the problem. We're proposing for the Children's Museum here to have a human habit trail, which will exploit some of the same notions. But what it allowed you to do, instead of writing long labels and having lecturers tell you about opposable thumbs and prehensile tails, which kids really don't have a way of relating to, we simply allowed kids to do things. In the process of doing it, they came to understand through their own experience what their bodies were and were not suited for. Very simple piece of equipment. A very frugal budget, I will also say. We built all the apparatus for all the animals for $875. Going back to some classroom materials, this issue of trying to relate themes about animals to themes about men is something that is also a sort of touchstone in my own work. I've been very interested in how you help children understand themselves. And one of the things, as Jerome Bruner has pointed out, is that you can't teach fish about the sea. You have to really get back from your own situation to understand things about yourself. And one way that children can do this very well is through looking at animals. And so while you're teaching about animals, you're really very interestingly able to talk about man-made themes. One example, this on the left was part of an introduction to a course called Man, A Course of Study, one piece of which on the right was a cut-apart baboon troop. And youngsters were asked to cut on the dotted lines and arrange the baboons, and they were identified by their role: dominant male, female with babies, juveniles, and arrange them the way they think the troop would be safest. And you can sort of imagine wagon train convoys and various things that kids would use as their database to try and speculate on what would be a safe organization. Who goes in front? Who goes in the back? Who do you put in the middle of the group? And coupled with this, students then look at ethnographic films that we produced, filmed in the Kalahari Desert, of baboons, and then go back and do this exercise again, and then spend about 2 weeks actually studying the social organization of baboon troops. Who's valuable in a society, and who can you allow to be knocked off first? It turns out the females with babies are the most precious, as you might guess. The older males, who are no longer the ones who are primarily mating with the key females, are allowed to go in the very front and the back, so if they get picked off, there's really no consequence to the troop, but because they're so big, they still look pretty menacing. And the males who are the honchos pretty much stay close to the center as well, near the females. But it's a problem-solving exercise, which is about social organization, about wildlife and territoriality, a whole series of things. Inventing artifacts like that cut-apart baboon troop becomes a major part of the kind of thing I've been doing, where you take an idea or concept And instead of using a existing artifact that already has things layered onto it, I've tried to design objects and artifacts which become tools for explaining an abstraction. In this case, we created a paper seal. It was a seal that was meant to be butchered, and what students did was cut this apart in the way that a Eskimo troop who were faced with the problem of getting along with each other in a sparse environment would have to do. They'd have to share. There's simply no way for the food to go around adequately unless there's some kind of pattern of sharing. And the pattern the Eskimos use is that it's not unlike what we do, except what they have a different set of names for it. What I would do in an Eskimo society, if I caught a seal, I would share the best part of it with my best friend, or the person I was closest to. But instead of calling him my best friend, or my wife, or whatever the relationship was, I would call him or her by the name of the part of the seal that we would share. So if the heart was the best part of the seal, I would call you my heart. And there's a reciprocity involved, so that if you caught a seal, you would be obligated, I would be your heart. So like kids knowing that you're my best friend, am I your best friend? Well, what we did, and by the way, if you had somebody you didn't care about, they might be your left flipper, and I'd be your left flipper, or your tail, or my tail. And in order to create an understanding of how this works and what some of the emotional dynamics are, we created a paper seal which kids butcher, and then they have to form naming partnerships. And by inviting kids to actually divvy themselves up among themselves in a class, they go through exactly the same kind of heart-rending emotional things that Eskimos go through and we all go through in forming bonding relationships. And it is a case of trying to invent an artifact which helps you model a social situation, and then developing a pedagogical plan, a teaching strategy, to help make a very abstract idea very understandable and intimate. And let me tell you, the kids really get very caught up in something like this. It has to be taught very carefully, and you have to teach teachers how to teach with these materials. But the task, as I say, as a designer, or as an educator, or some combination, is to invent these systems, these artificial artifacts. Another example in that same unit, on the left and right are two versions, two prototypes of a seal hunting game. In this case, the sharing isn't the issue, but capturing the seals. As some of you may know, there's a pattern that seals use during the winter. They keep open 8 or 10 breathing holes each, 7 or 8 breathing holes, and then they go under the ice and periodically go up to one or another of their breathing holes. And these breathing holes tend to be scattered and covered over a wide area. And if Eskimos were to indiscriminately go out and just scatter themselves, the chance of them being at a seal breathing hole, waiting at any particular hole where a seal would come up, very remote. And what Eskimos have evolved is a strategy for essentially saturation hunting an area. They collectively go out and blanket a focused area, with the assumption being that if they cover a small area, they are likely to get several of the breathing holes of any particular seal, and they maximize their chance of getting a seal. Once it's caught, then they have a sharing pattern for how they deal with it. Going it alone produces starvation, and that's a mathematical model that we recognized could be created and shared with the kids. And so what we did was we created a device which mathematically had the capability of being programmed to model the seal pattern. On the left, a series of corks which can be pulled out of a box. Underneath that is a wheel, and while there are 160 some odd holes or something, there are only 1 in 7 seals as represented by stickers underneath those holes, and the disc under that top panel rotates. So by spinning the disc, you can reprogram the device each round, and the hole you hunted last time will not produce a seal the next time necessarily. Kids got so psyched up in trying to count the revolutions of the dial instead of thinking about seals that we decided, hell with it, let's not even try and hide the seals from them. So we made a clear plastic version so they could see it spinning, But in this case, we changed the rules so they had to first put their marker down with their number on a hole and then spin the thing. And it was an attempt to sort of circumvent their trying to circumvent us. And you find that in developing teaching materials like this, there's an enormous amount of learning on your own part, psyching out your audience, trying to anticipate the kinds of intentions that will be put to your device. And as you can see, from some of these things get pretty elaborate in terms of what you end up doing. We ended up vacuum forming several different versions of these things. We had all kinds of design engineering problems to encounter. We finally ended up with for expense purposes and several other things, a die-cut cardboard board with cap plugs. You may be familiar with them as the things that protect pipes when they're in transit or various things like that. And the key thing here is that you have to bear in mind what we're trying to do is get kids involved in a real situation. We're not trying to teach them the game, we're trying to teach them the reality. And so what you do is you try and make the device the minimal intrusion on the reality situation, still keeping some of the gaminess, the funness of what only a game can be. And I will tell you that this game involves kids coming up with strategies which are so close to the reality situation that it's spellbinding. One of the things that the game is predicated on is that you have to ante up a day of food supply for each day you hunt. In this case meant peeling off a sticker and sticking it down on a tally sheet. Each time you got a seal, you got a string of these stickers, 7 of them. That was good for 7 days of hunting, or 7 cork pullings. The effect of that is that you get down pretty low, and you're forced to make a deal with somebody else because you don't have enough food. And the deals run like, if you give me 2, I'll give you 3 when I get a seal. Or you see actual cheating and stealing. Kids hiding and holding back and not revealing how much they really have. All similar things to what would happen in a real situation, and things that in many ways model Eskimo behavior that the kids do see. And again, in ethnographic films, there are about 13 hours of ethnographic films that have been made in Pelly Bay, Northwest Territories, that these kids are also observing, so they're not entirely dealing with just abstractions. I didn't make the films, so I didn't bring slides of those, but the kids are getting a very thorough database on what some of the reality of this looks like, but they're also getting a chance to make their own, come to their own understanding of it through games like this. There's essentially a calendar, and each day you're obligated to put down a sticker, and there's a score sheet. Essentially, it becomes a tally, and kids play this game in successive rounds so that the kids who have not shared see the consequences of their not sharing. The kids who have saturation hunted, who've decided, for example, to make a deal, let's you and I and Sally all hunt this area, they're going to succeed much more readily. We don't tell them that. We let them play several rounds of the game until they come to it themselves, and they experiment with their own way of dealing with this economy. The important thing is it's really real for these kids. It's not an abstraction. I mean, it becomes like Monopoly, if you've ever stayed up all night playing Monopoly. It's serious business. So that's an example of kind of artificial artifacts. They're not really real things, or I don't know what a fake thing is. It's a real something else. But one example of what can be done with real artifacts involved just an artifact kit which we developed. What we tried to do was sensitize kids to how much you can learn about a culture by looking at its artifacts, its indigenous things. And to do that, as an introduction, we created an American artifact kit. And essentially it was a collection of little cloth bags, each of which had an artifact in it. And the artifacts were things from our culture which kids had to make inferences about and speculate on what kind of culture would have an object like this, and what can you learn about a society just from the artifact. And essentially they would be asked to develop an ethnography based on just simply, what kind of people are these who make things like this, what kind of skills they have, what do they care about, what is something like this used for. it's a different tradition of teaching, obviously, than traditional ones, and I've included some slides here of the early days of the Boston Children's Museum. In fact, most museums, right up to the Indianapolis Children's Museum today, have not deviated a great deal from the kinds of things that we probably all remember from our first museum experiences before museums adopted an attitude of letting kids touch things, not having valuable things on exhibit, and essentially a rather formal appreciation giving and veneration of artifacts. That's partly a reflection of the kind of people who work for museums. Their training tends to be, and has over the years tended to be, specialization in a subject matter area. In other words, Egyptologists or anthropologists or sociologists or art historians, people who have been trained in a discipline that relates to a particular area of expertise. The designers of exhibits, the people who planned them, were skilled in things like lighting or cabinet making, and the role of a designer in most museums has traditionally been, remains today, you're relegated to being a subordinate vehicle for the curators. The people who the museum was founded by and operated by and large, are people who know an area or discipline, and design is seen as a tool, as a vehicle in the employ of these curators. And the gentleman on your left is probably very skilled at knowing what kind of monk's cloth to mount things on and what kind of pins are the appropriate ones to hold what kind of cloth, and probably had no pretensions of being a teacher or a planner of educational strategies. And where there was interpretive staff on a museum staff, they were called docents, people who would essentially stand in front of a showcase and lecture about the contents. If they were ambitious, as this woman was, they might dress up and do a role play of some kind in places like Sturbridge Village or Mystic Seaport or Williamsburg, make some effort towards this. But essentially the visitor is passive, really has very little to do but sit and listen and hopefully grasp some of what's being said. The ultimate effect is a put down. You feel stupid and you realize how smart the person who's teaching you is, and you don't come away feeling very worthy or powerful yourself. You're in awe of the authority figure who's been demonstrating to you or showing you what they know. And it's equivalent to, in many ways, what television does in terms of just talking at you. The other thing it did was it very rarely, as on the right, used things that couldn't happen in the classroom just as well. The kind of special facilities and special opportunities that museums can provide better than the classroom were not typically used. And so the kind of teaching you see here really does go on very much if you go through the kind of tours that are conducted in any of our major museums today. Well, at Boston, when I first was hired by the new director in 1964, Mike Spock, who was the son of the famous baby doctor, was hired to change the Boston Children's Museum. He had never run a museum before, and he was good enough to hire me. I had some experience in the previous year working for Charles Eames on a number of exhibits, and Mike hired me to be the design director of the Boston Children's Museum, where I designed all their exhibits and publications for the next 4 or 5 years. First as a staff member for 1 year, and then as a consultant to them after starting my own firm in 1965, and continued to have them as my first and continuing client. Well, the attitude we adopted at Boston was that if it wasn't able to be handled, we didn't want it on display. We really had to take a strong stance, we felt, and explain by our actions that we didn't care about the content of the museum. We cared about what went on in it. The process of learning was more important than the artifacts and the collection. It was only 12 or 14 years ago, but it was heretical. I can remember calling several of the local Boston museums and saying, I've got these 8 showcases. Would you like any of them? And they'd say, what's the matter with them? They broken? The glass broken? Are the locks intact? I said, oh, they're fine. Well, what's the matter with them? Because the showcases, as you know, are very, very valuable. And I said, nothing matter with them. We're just not going to have them anymore. Well, what are you going to do with your stuff? Well, we're going to put it in storage or give it to other collections who feel they want to exhibit this. And people were really incredulous just a few years ago that a museum would adopt such a strategy. Well, what we were left to exhibit were things that we thought could be handled. It didn't mean only artificial objects that we made, but things that were not so valuable that if they got damaged or broken, there'd be any great consequence. One of the first exhibits I did was called How Movies Move, and the choice of topic was a little shaky for some people. The museums, that museum and most museums up till then, still were having exhibits on things like winter birds or the seashore or the geology of this region, early settlers, topics which had some legitimacy from a historical point of view, but really didn't lend themselves very well to being grasped in any kind of reasonable way by young minds. And our attitude was that if you can't really deal with a complicated subject like that adequately, don't do it. And so instead we took some very simple, plain ideas, some of which were sophisticated, but which they were not pretentious or very lofty. In this case, we suggested that kids could understand that movies don't really move, that it's really a series of still pictures coming one after another that give the illusion of motion. And in the exhibit we had many, many artifacts and ideas which explained the notion of a series of still images coming one after another. And we had everything from Peanuts cartoons to an edited film of chase sequences from early silent films where for 2 minutes kids could watch bathtubs running down staircases and motorcycles running through gravel pits and just wonderful, wacky things. And next to it were 35mm blow-ups of the full sequence on a light table, a horizontal light table, so they could see that from the top to the bottom of these 3-foot strips, there was hardly any change in motion. It took a long time for any action to pass. And so where they could see in one frame an axe be lifted and then down halfway, and knew that in the film it went by like that, and see how many pictures it took, they started to get some sense of the volume of images it took. And we included a series of antique and early filmmaking experimental devices which explained this idea. I went to New York and bought some old mutoscopes, these penny arcade machines you've all seen, and just took off the sides and put plexiglass in their place and let kids see the flicker fusion effect, as it's called by psychologists. The persistence of vision is the issue that the kids don't get told this, but they observe that it's your mind remembers the previous image so quickly on the tail of the next one. We also invited kids to make their own movies. And we pre-printed strips of paper, like a storyboard, and invited kids to doodle or very carefully draw images in each of the frames, put the frames in one of these hat box-like devices with slots on the side, and spin it, and see the effect of their own movie making. Very little kids could simply watch what other people had done, and in fact we included some laminated versions of some antique zoetrope strips. This device was called a zoetrope, the wheel of life. I named my first daughter Zoe, it means life in Greek. Same word for zoo, by the way. And older kids could do very sophisticated analyses of motion and do some very ambitious filmmaking. And my favorite story about this exhibit is one night we had a bachelor party for Mike Spock's brother, and the museum was closed, of course, except to the guests, and we all sat around making pornographic movies. But it's an example of how one exhibit can have the mileage to appeal to a wide range of minds, and so everybody can get something out of it. And it's an attribute that I constantly have to try and incorporate. It's a hard thing to do. I've made a series of these objects in another form for the New York State Council on the Arts for a traveling exhibit, which essentially is a showcase exhibit. Kids don't get to touch these and do as much with them. But it took each of the kind of precursors of motion picture and made a mechanical model of it in a uniform enough format so you could observe the difference in the principle. Each one was an evolution of the art of filmmaking. Another exhibit which relied heavily on real artifacts, not ones we made, was an exhibit called Size. And in this exhibit, we took some very, very large and some very, very small objects of the same type. It's a big and a little bottle of Tabasco sauce, and a huge hawser and a little piece of thread. There's a huge bolt from a locomotive and a tiny little watchmaker's nut and bolt. There's an ostrich and a chickadee's egg. There's a Diplodocus thigh bone. That's the femur of an early dinosaur, and the femur of a shrew. The exact same shape, slightly different proportion. There's also, as you can see on the right, a tiny little fiddle, and there's a button, and you can push that button and hear that fiddle being played. At the same time, a big bass viol is sitting out where you can handle that. It's durable enough, and you can just hear the difference in the sound that the size of an instrument can make. Some of the objects were touchable, where we could allow them to be. That's a molar of an elephant. And some of them you got to do. We got the whole starting lineup of the Celtics to give us their sneakers, and they signed their names inside the way you would when you go to camp, you know. And these little kids would sit down on a little stool and try on the Celtic sneakers. It was wonderful. Another part of the exhibit involved your own body. In another way, we simply cut out some ozite carpeting in patterns and laid them out in these cut-out versions and asked kids to try and find the size that fit them. And it was a kind of exercise in estimating, you know, what size are you? We had a series of lenses, which were Fresnel lenses and distorting lenses, so the whole optical quality of how size can be changed by some of these devices became available. We had a place where kids could put a sticker. There was like a take a check dispenser you'd get when you were waiting to be next in line, except there were pressure-sensitive labels, and you were invited to write your name on it and stick it on the wall at your height. And what we ended up with was a demography of who visited the museum, or how high you could jump. We cleaned this up. These were Formica panels, essentially, and we simply dadoed the top layer down to the masonite. So we got 1-inch striations. There were 1-foot bands, and then the 1-inch increments were just scored, essentially. And we just take the whole thing down with acetone once a month and clear it all off again. We also created a huge desk blotter, a green desk blotter with leather corners at 12 times the scale that you would normally see such a desktop. And everything just became this crazy, outrageous set of experiences. That was a 12-inch ruler that became 12 feet. And you got to do some things with some of these objects. That was a huge billboard we got from Donnelly Advertising. We mounted it to drywall, that very thick cardboard, and it was a jigsaw puzzle. We made a huge, huge fiberglass telephone. That's one way of trying to communicate with artifacts. Another very important experience for me was an exhibit where I didn't create the artifacts, but I was asked to help develop an exhibit which would use the artifacts produced by a young bunch of students in the third, fourth grades in Cardozo in Washington. The Cardozo neighborhood is all black, and you may or may not recall that in 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, it was in Cardozo that the most difficult rioting broke out. There was incredible amounts of looting and burning in the black community. And the young brothers and sisters of the kids who were doing the looting, of course, were caught up in a terrible, terrible, traumatic episode. And I happened at the time to be working with a bunch of black teachers who were particularly sensitive to the emotional needs of these kids at this time. And instead of teaching at the kids, they tried to create a vehicle whereby these youngsters would have ways of venting themselves, of expressing themselves through what they were doing in the classes. And instead of teaching the normal curriculum, they invited kids to express themselves about what was going on in their neighborhood. And these were kids living right in the midst of the kinds of trashing and looting that were going on. And so the art teachers and the English teachers invited kids to draw and write and sketch what they saw and what they felt. And I was asked to do an exhibit of this work. This was the 4 days after the work was produced. Within 4 days, they knew they wanted to exhibit it. And they asked me to come down and work with them and with the students to do an exhibit at the Smithsonian of the stuff that the kids were producing, knowing that this was really powerful stuff and that it ought to get out. And I came down, and we had really no budget and no time, and we designed and produced an exhibit in 2 days, 3 days altogether, actually. The first day I got there, I spent most of the day with the kids, their teachers, and looking at their stuff. And that night, being without a studio or staff, trying to concoct an idea for the exhibit, I was without tools, and the only thing I could do was go to the neighborhood pharmacy, and I bought 2 bags of caramels and made an exhibit plan using the caramels for an exhibit that would use a module of boxes, and essentially proposed to create a funeral parlor. This was still the week that Dr. King was buried. And the notion was to create a sculptural kind of experience where you were in an environment which had its own kind of awesomeness. And simply by laying out cardboard boxes in the configuration of a coffin and creating a cruciform at the head of the coffin, we would evoke a certain kind of attitude about what this event was all about, what the feelings underlying the kids' work was all about. And so we adopted that strategy, got $87 worth of boxes, which was the total exhibit budget, believe it or not. And we simply took the student work and dry mounted it onto these boxes and used our right hand if we were left-handed, or left hand if we were right-handed, to magic marker the kids' comments that they had written. We transcribed them onto the boxes. I'll just let you read some of them. The exhibit's really, obviously, a background to some very powerful stuff. Well, one of the things in my business is that you don't always know if your exhibit's getting across to an audience. It's one thing to stand in front of a group like this, and if people laugh or if they boo or if they walk out early, you get some feedback and you have some idea if things are working. But if you stop and think about it, I think architects, designers don't usually have access to the users in a way that really lets them understand how their product is going over. It's particularly frustrating with exhibits because there aren't criteria for assessing the effectiveness of learning in exhibits. And what would you measure? The length of time someone stands in front of something, or how long they stay in the exhibit itself? Do you there have been some effective, some proposed strategies where you put tape down in front of pieces of your exhibit, and the tape that gets worn out the most tells you which is your most popular exhibit. There are not very accurate methodologies that have been developed over the last 15 or 20 years, although a lot of people have proposed that their methods are, for assessing the effectiveness of exhibits. And it's not to say that we shouldn't try, and so we got a grant to do an exhibit whose sole purpose was to find out what kinds of exhibit techniques were better and worse than others. It's a very preposterous and ambitious undertaking, but we wanted to find out what kinds of feedback techniques could we develop which would teach us that this teaches better than something else. And to do it, we picked a topic which we were pretty sure our kids wouldn't know anything about. And what we proposed to do was pre- and post-test people going to the exhibit and simply find out what percentage of people knew something, what we're talking about, before they went in, then let them go into the exhibit, and then find out on leaving what percentage of them had learned. And in the course of a year and a half, the grant allowed us to modify the content of the exhibits, putting in and taking out certain devices to find out which of those devices work better than others. Sounds pretty simple. In fact, to develop a control set of situations and a data keeping system, it was preposterously expensive. And we had, I'd say, mixed success in proving anything. It turned out that we learned a great deal about exhibit crafting, but I'm not convinced it was ultimately a particularly successful scientific demonstration. What we did was we taught kids about shearing and grinding molars. We wanted them to be able to recognize the difference between two types of teeth, that they would recognize the difference in the form and the function and be able to look at teeth they hadn't seen before and recognize them as molars and then discern whether they were shearing or grinding molars. Pretty esoteric stuff. You could be pretty sure that most kids, most adults coming in, did not have an easy handle on that one. And so we worked out a system for trying out this stuff on people before, during, and after. And we developed a whole series of crazy devices which, by their nature, allowed people to respond in methods, in ways that we could quantify, we could count. We could count clicks, we could count wrong answers, we could see how many people got how far down the scale, and so on. And everything had to be quantifiable in order to be able to be calculated and ultimately assessed. And so we had things like oversized models of a shearing molar, a set of molars and a grinding molar. A shearing molar, just for your information, goes up and down like a shears. Your teeth go up and down, and they cut the way a scissor would by having two teeth come down next to each other, as opposed to grinding molars, which, like a mortar and pestle, rotate and move like that. Well, in this oversized model, not only could you physically discern the shape, but you also could move the teeth up and down, and only up and down, whereas next to it was a set of grinding molars, which you could only move by rotating them against each other. And so by physically going through that kind of gross motor activity of going, this way, as opposed to this, you sort of taught yourself with your own arm movement what your teeth were doing in a very exaggerated way. And it both used, it's almost a super graphic idea, if you think about it as a diagram. We used every kind of contrivance in this exhibit you can imagine. We had animated skulls talking. We had meat eaters and herbivores, and we in the course of a year and a half tried almost everything you can imagine. We even had a peanut machine with a cup of pennies next to it, and invited people to stand in front of a mirror and eat peanuts and see which teeth they used. It was a really nifty set of experiments. We had a great deal of fun. As I say, it's a dubious pedagogical concern, I think, in terms of what it actually proved in terms of how you teach. So much of our concern was involved with the techniques and the configurations and the mechanics that I don't think the exhibit ultimately was very proved much. We did teach a lot of people, by the way. We did find out that people learned in the exhibit, and that was that was satisfying to some extent. There are other ways to involve people besides having them touch or try on things. And I think an important thing that I've had to face is when people want to develop a please touch museum, or a please touch zoo, they think entirely in terms of, feeding the animals or picking up something. But it really is their mind you're after, not their hand. And what you have to do is constantly try and invent ways of making vivid, making intelligible something that is by itself not really readable. The Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre was translated by our office into an animated puppet show. There are slots in the floor of that stage you see on the right, and these puppets are two-dimensional. They are copied from the Revere engraving in various stances and postures and so on. And the audience listens to a narration of the Boston Massacre, what happened, as recounted by an American. It takes 2.5 to 3 minutes, and then immediately following that, the show repeats again, this time narrated by an Englishman. And the exact same action occurs. There's no difference in the action, but just the interpretation is totally different. And what the audience is asked to do is vote on what was the accurate version. We present two very plausible versions. They're both quite credible. And in fact, the Boston Massacre during the Revolution, at the time and since, has remained a controversy. There's several ways of interpreting it. It's almost identical to Kent State. As you study the history, who ordered the soldiers to fire? Was anybody really in danger? Was the mob really an unruly rabble, or were they intimidating a poor beleaguered officer? We had a whole wonderful crew of historians working with us on this, and the more we learned, the more up-to-date the whole thing seemed. But the point of this was that this was one piece of an exhibit on the Revolution, which we did as part of our planning for Boston's major bicentennial exhibit. And it was really, the voting strategy was every bit as engaging, every bit as participatory as something you might have been able to touch or pick up or break or whatever. And I just suggest that there are lots of ways into somebody's head. Trying to get around a problem is usually the most creative time for our office. We're either under-budgeted or under-scheduled, or something else is lacking, or a particular predicament. This job was just full of problems. It was part of a shopping complex, the Chestnut Hill Mall in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, and our client was a discount drugstore, a schlock junkie drugstore which prided itself on its cut-rate prices and low-class merchandising style. They viewed this as a very purposeful strategy to bring in customers who were looking for a bargain. And everything that connoted good design and something being done